Deus Vult, the cry that would signal the call for the First Crusade. However, as Pope Urban II was rallying his armies, another man was at work. Peter the Hermit. Peter had attempted to go to the Holy Land in the past, but had been prevented due to past actions. He saw this as his chance, and he traveled all over Europe gathering men and women to join him on his People's Crusade of the Holy Land. They marched down en masse to the Byzantine Empire, where Alexios warned them not to go any further, because they had no idea what they were getting into. The peasants ignored him, of course, and marched on, pillaging Byzantine towns as they went to feed themselves, all in the name of God, of course, and finally reached the Holy Land, to be slaughtered by the Seljuks. Yeah, they were crushed like an ant under a thumb, and those who were not killed were forced to convert to Islam and then enslaved. Now, this actually ended up working against the Seljuk Turks. See, it's kind of a rule in the Islamic Empire at this time that if your captives convert to Islam, you can't enslave them. But the Seljuks really just did with their own thing. They did what they wanted, so the Islamic Empire really wasn't too fond of them at this point. They weren't going to all out fight them or hurt them or anything because the Seljuks were convenient for conquering new territory. But they weren't exactly thrilled about their disregard for Islamic rules. This would also have another disastrous impact for the Seljuks, but they just didn't realize what yet. But you'll see. Today we're going to be getting into the meat of the First Crusade. I hope you guys are excited. We're going to try to get through this as quickly and easily as possible. And after going through the whole thing, I realize we'll have to break down the First Crusade into two parts because there is a lot to cover. So let's get into it. Back in Europe, Urban had gathered his armies, but his speech at Clermont had been more powerful than he'd expected. Knights and lords were not the only ones wishing to go into battle. Monks, women, and even sickly old men were begging to join in the crusade. The Pope tried to urge against this, but this was nearly impossible, because so many wished to receive salvation through this crusade as the Pope had assured them. The cry of Deus Vult had been heard through all of Europe, it seemed. And luckily, the Pope did get at least a few of the men he wanted. Two of the first lords to sign up were some of the most powerful lords in France, Aldemar Lepoy and Raymond of Toulouse, who both took up the cross at once. As time went on, more and more lords gathered until by the end 4 armies were established. They were led by several Western European rulers. One army was led by Raymond of Toulouse and Aldemar of Lepoy, as mentioned before. There was also Godfrey of Boulogne and his dear brother, my boy Baldwin of Boulogne, also known as King Baldwin. Remember this mad lad, we'll get back to him, who led Godfrey's army. There was also the Italian Norman forces led by Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred, also of Taranto, who led the Bohemond army, as well as a few other minor lords of France, all being led by folks like Robert II of Normandy and Hugh of Vermandois, who both led their own armies.
And the aptly named Sir not appearing in this film.
In total, the armies together numbered around 100,000 people. This included infantrymen, priests to bless their pilgrimage, a few civilians who wished to go on the pilgrimage themselves and see the holy sites, and of course, many knights. They acted as the main cavalry forces. Now keep in mind, this is before the time of the Templar Order, so you won't hear me talk about the Templars much here, but they will come up later, so bear that in mind. All in all, it can be said that many of the Crusaders joined not for wicked or selfish goals, though granted at least a few did, but most did it out of a sense of personal piety. Some Crusaders bringing their whole families along, selling their property and belongings to the church. Even Robert II of Normandy actually gave up his position to his brother William of England, which would have its own crazy part to play in history, but that's for another time. The point is that the myth of the Crusaders only going to the Holy Land for personal greed or feelings of xenophobic superiority is almost entirely false. Consider for a moment the cost of this expedition and the absolutely hazardous conditions that they were going to be walking in. It cost a ton of money and resources to bring such a large number of people on this journey, and many wouldn't survive because, again, you're marching into Arabia. Not exactly a pleasure cruise. Some would die of heat exhaustion, starvation, disease, and thirst. When they finally reached Constantinople, the Crusaders were hungry, tired, and thirsty, and they expected Alexios to give them help and provisions. But Alexios was a little suspicious. Not only were these Crusader Catholics, and still untrusting of the Orthodox Church, but one of them was Bohemond, and he had led attacks on the Byzantine Empire in the past with his father when he was younger, and feared he may have similar intentions now as well. Before he could provide any help to the Crusaders, he ordered them all to swear fealty to him and swear that they would return any Byzantine lands to the empire that had been captured by the Seljuks. All the Crusaders swore this oath except for Raymond of Toulouse, who simply said he wouldn't bring any harm to the empire. Alexios then gave them their ships and supplies that they would need to get to the Holy Lands, and also advised them about the Seljuk tactics and methods of war to better prepare them for the battle. With that out of the way, the Crusaders left, and in the early half of 1097, they would cross into Asia Minor and ascend upon the first great battle of the Crusades, the Siege of Nicaea. Nicaea was a land once owned by the Byzantines, and also incredibly valuable to Christians as well, because this is where the Council of Nicaea had been held in the past, which was a major piece of Christian history. But now it was the center of power for the Seljuk Turks. Upon arrival, the Crusaders encountered Peter the Hermit and the remnants of his destroyed People's Crusade. They pulled a Sergeant Schultz very quickly when asked, "What the heck happened?"
"I know nothing. Nothing."
Now, since this is the seat of Seljuk power, you might think that the Seljuks were in full force, right? Well, remember how I said defeating the People's Crusade would work against the Seljuks? Well, it did here, because when the Seljuks heard another crusade was coming, they assumed this crusade would be just a bunch of peasants again. The Sultan of the Seljuks, Kilij Arslan, actually left to go deal with another battle with his rivals near Persia, not thinking he would be needed to help his army stop some meek peasants. And boy, was he wrong. The Crusaders struck with a power that the Seljuks did not expect, and they were quickly forced back behind the walls of their city. This is where the battle grew ever fiercer, both sides suffering heavy casualties. When Kilij heard news of this, he returned with reinforcements to attack the Crusaders, but these two were pushed back. However, the Crusaders were at a disadvantage. Nicaea was situated on Lake Iznik, a large lake the Turks could use to reinforce and resupply endlessly. Because the Crusaders couldn't blockade it, the Turks could have an endless supply of resources. So something had to be done about it. Alexios came up with a plan. He had the Crusader ships rolled onto the land using logs so they could get the ships onto the lake and blockade the city. Upon seeing these monstrous ships being rolled up onto the land with these logs, the Turks realized what was being planned, and they quickly surrendered on the 18th of June. The entire battle lasted for nearly 2 months. After their victory at Nicaea, the Crusaders split their army into 2 halves so that they could move more quickly and effectively. The Normans took one army and the French took the other. They agreed to meet at Dorylaeum. However, Kilij Arslan had learned the might of the Crusaders now and would try to ambush them on the road. The Normans were faster than the French and made it closer to Dorylaeum first, where Arslan was waiting. Leading his armies of horse archers and Turkish warriors down, he led a surprise attack on the Norman forces, cutting down unprepared soldiers and non-combatants alike. Bohemond quickly rallied his knights to defend the women and children, ordering them to form a tight defensive line around the non-combatants and less armored foot soldiers. Their superior armor and shields gave them a strong defensive position, but it came at a cost. The Turkish horse archers now had free maneuverability around the battlefield, and thus the Normans were completely surrounded. The battle now was one of attrition. Bohemond knew that he could not hope to defeat the Seljuks in this condition and called for aid from the French, praying they'd arrive in time. Meanwhile, the Seljuks harassed and battered against the Norman line, but neither were truly giving an inch. The women who had come with the Crusaders acted as field nurses and water carriers for the Crusader warriors, allowing the line to stay supplied and nourished. But the horse archers of the Turks were a near unbeatable force. While the arrows they fired didn't do much damage against the shields and armor of the knights couldn't get close enough to do any real damage to the archers, as they'd retreat out of reach before a counterattack could be thrown. A few brave knights broke from the ranks at times to try and hack a few Turks up, but would either be killed in the process, or they'd be forced back. Some 2,000 Crusaders died at the hands of the Turks in battle. The end looked near for the Normans as the Turks became more and more aggressive, pushing the knights back all the way to the banks of a local river. After 7 hours of grueling battle, at last the Crusaders were reinforced by a sudden surprise attack from the French forces. The cavalry of the French knights rushed the Turks and the battle was turned. However, even with this turning tide, the Turks did not surrender easily and attempted to hold the line, falling only back towards their camp. However, this also proved to be fruitless. Adhemar of Lipoi had led his forces around the battle to outflank the Turks and attack from the rear, setting their camp in flames in the process. Devastated by the loss of their camp and horrified at how these men of iron, as they were called, could withstand arrow barrages and most sword strikes, the Seljuks fell back and retreated. This would allow the Crusaders to cross Anatolia almost unopposed, giving the Crusaders yet another victory. However, this victory came at a great cost for the Crusaders. As Kilij Arslan retreated, he had his army burn and destroy everything behind them. not unlike the Russians would do against Nazi Germany centuries in the future. This scorched earth tactic meant that the Crusaders could not resupply while making the 3-month hike to Antioch, and they would make this trek in the heat of summer. During this time, many of the crusading leaders squabbled and argued about their leadership within the crusade, and many people died of starvation and thirst along the way. They were sometimes resupplied by Christians who lived within the area, but more often than not, the Crusaders had to, well, just ransack villages and towns for supplies, pillaging what they needed to. Not only this, but the Crusaders would actually lose one of their leaders along the way, Baldwin of Boulogne, who lost his wife shortly after the battle, and she was his only tie to his European lands and wealth. Without it, he had no incentive to return to Europe, so he elected to stay in the Holy Lands and form his own fiefdom. He broke away from the crusading armies and traveled to Edessa, where he remarried Arda of Armenia, who would become the first queen of Jerusalem. He and she established the Kingdom of Edessa, which was the first Crusader state established. Baldwin and Arda would go on to become the rulers of Jerusalem after Godfrey, Baldwin's brother, passed away in 1100. The throne would then be passed on to Baldwin's son, Baldwin II, and then in the years to come, a descendant of Baldwin who would be known as Baldwin IV, the Leper King, and one of the heroes of the later Crusades would come. But that's for another time. What you need to know for now is that the Crusaders are now feeling the weight of this war, and now are marching on to Antioch, which would be one of their greatest battles yet, and the Islamic forces would show the Crusaders the toughest battle they'd ever fought. But it's here that we'll leave the Crusaders. We'll return next time to finish the First Crusade. We'll discuss in as much detail as possible what happened at the Battle of Antioch, how Bohemond severed himself from the Crusaders, leaving them to go on to Jerusalem without him, what happened at the Siege of Jerusalem, and then we will discuss what the Crusaders did once they took Jerusalem. We'll also talk about the effects of the First Crusade, and was it worth it? What after effects and aftermath came from the First Crusade, and we can discuss, historically speaking, were the Crusades worth the effort? A difficult question to answer, but one that I think's worth it. But, again, this is where we'll leave it for today. Alright guys, we will see you in the next video. Hope you're enjoying this. Talk to you later.